Ultimately in life, I've learned things happen. We might not want them to, but they do happen, against our will and wishes. Yet if we aspire to control everything, we as people would enjoy nothing. But what if there was a world where creativity was boundless and the laws of applied scientists and physics were thrown out the window? What if there was a gateway to an unknown place, a world where your imagination and dreams could run rampant, but you couldn't control it, not knowing the effects of every action taken shunted by the consequences? But you want to know because godlyhood is in control and understanding. Control is interesting because the world the story inhabits is interesting, and creative being unpredictable, not its characters because they suck dick, and don't drive the force of the story, which in turn is extremely lackluster yet a mess of a masterpiece all at once. To elaborate, video games and literature, including comic books and graphic novels, are constructions, and much like a skyscraper, everything that makes the building is everything that's built in a story, meaning that everything exists for a reason. It's not there just to be there, but Control as a video game has concepts and story ideas as well as story beats that exist solely because the developers wanted this concept to exist. However, a rationalization or a analysis of this thoughts I have against this narrative formula from the 20 hours I played completing the main quest, all the side quests, and mostly collecting the majority of all collectibles to discover more lore, you can come to the logical conclusion that this game refuses to answer its greatest questions solely because they cannot be understood, they cannot be controlled, and the most atrocious answer of them all, we the writers were too lazy to write an explanation for the question you have, because the entire point of the game is that there is no controlling the unknown, therefore we shouldn't stress over it. But because I spent my hard, well-earned money, I'll stress over it in this video. Ergo, why is the Russian janitor, who is without a doubt the coolest and most likable character in the game, able to teleport and psionically connect with people while reading minds, that is also able to create psychic portraits, able to do so? Don't think about it. What is the actual plane than a tutorial guide for new powers and abilities that the player receives, as well as boss fights that aren't even a part of the main storyline? Don't think about it. If the board of directors is a giant upside down black pyramid that controls the owner's house, and me the player who is Jesse Faden, the director at the Federal Bureau of Control, what is the board? Who is the board? What are their motivations? Why do they help secure, control, and police these supernatural anomalies? And more importantly, why are they a giant black upside down pyramid besides to make an Illuminati joke? Don't think about it. What happened to the scientist Darling, who is another likable character in this game who is extremely funny and enjoyable to watch? Don't think about it. What the hell is the hiss? Is it a dark force of evil because the writers said it was, and because the main protagonist thinks it is? Or does it have some sort of motivation to conquer our reality and hissify everyone? Don't think about it. What is the slide projector? If it's a dimensional gateway between realities, where does it go? What is its origin point? Where did it come from besides it being used as a plot device to use to jumpstart the heroine's adventure to discover the secret clandestine Federal Agency of Control? What the hell happened with Jessie and her brother when they originally went into the slide projector when they were children and met Polaris? Don't think about it. What is even Polaris, considering this game is dealing with unknown astral entities and residents that border on fringe sciences and studies? How is the Department of Control able to control or create Hindran, which contains Polaris' real form? Which is nothing, because I know it's nothing, because it explodes even though I killed all the enemies in this level, and it shouldn't have exploded. Because if Polaris is the same entity structurally similar to the Hiss, doesn't that mean it can possess people or have a physical form? Meaning that if Polaris can be contained in Hedron, doesn't that mean the Hiss can be contained as well? Well, the answer to that question is yes and no. But the game refuses to explain how Jesse is connected to Polaris, because they went on an adventure that only is hinted in text documents and audio logs, so don't think about it. Why did Polaris protect Jesse from the hiss, but for some reason couldn't protect her brother from it? And the backstory that isn't seen, isn't playable, and is only talked about in audio logs and redacted text documents? I don't know, so don't think about it. Control as a game leaves a lot of lingering unanswered questions such as these and more, and it doesn't do anything to rectify the player with answers besides that they are unknown and maybe unanswerable. But then you look at other storytelling mediums that answer unquestionable and unanswerable questions such as Marvel and DC Comics. One of my personal gripes with the narratives is, why can the previous director of the Bureau of Control who killed himself talk to us the player even though he's dead? The story tries to haphazardly explain this, saying that the bullet he killed himself with is relative in time. Thus, and very much like DC Comics' Final Crisis event written by Masterclass writer Grant Morrison, who writes about this cosmic anomaly shit, who is famous for writing other books such as Happy, Good Omens, and Doom Patrol. It continues to write stories about the absolutely absurd and completely unimaginable, and characters facing Lovecraftian type beasts which they struggle to understand but somehow manage to defeat or circumvent through dumb luck sometimes. But talking about and discussing DC's Final Crisis event, basically the long story short for it is the multiverse is dying, and an entire universe is about to end by an unknown cause. The explanation for why this is all happening is that the villain named Darkseid fired a bullet from the future into the past that traveled 100 years backwards to kill another character named Orion, after during a battle with Darkseid that is currently happening is fatally wounded in battle, which caused him to fall over onto the multiverse, thus destroying it in current day, wiping out and eradicating all time and space. The larger explanation to this is that Darkseid is a 10th dimensional being that exists outside the DC universe, and the only reason why he exists within DC Comics and why the heroes within the Justice League could fight him and defeat him is solely because Darkseid's body in the real world isn't the real Darkseid's body. However, a physical avatar and manifestation of the 10th dimensional him that enters the DC Comics universe, thus explaining all the previous iterations of Darkseid that have battled with the Justice League have been fighting are nothing but mere imitations of the real Darkseid that's existing outside of time and space as a 10th dimensional being that can manipulate the multiverse, thus them battling the weaker avatars of himself that were sent into the multiverse to do his bidding, while his 10th dimensional physical form was the puppet master of all the events. And this is the worst part, by the way, because Darkseid is a 10th dimensional god, assumably larger than the known universe and the multiverse combined, because he fell on it, everything and everyone dies. That's how powerful this character is. And our heroes, who was the Justice League, accumulating Batman, Superman, Hawkgirl, Hawkman, Green Lantern, Martian Manhunter, and everyone else, are put up against something they cannot control, cannot understand, and that's larger than the known universe that they know, and the multiverse in their entirety. And they somehow have to fight against completely unreasonable odds where they have a literal 0.0000000 infinite 0.1% of actually succeeding in stopping the universe, their universe, from dying, while everything else comes crashing and dying around them. If you want to know how this gets resolved, go read DC's Comics Final Crisis event. What was the point of me mentioning this? The point is, what explanation DC Comics is able to provide for something completely ludicrous as that? What explanation does Control give? Basically, when the previous director shot himself, the bullet took a long ass time to kill him, as it slowly splinters through his head, and we, simply the player, are only hearing the echoes of what he knows through something called the Hotline, which is another paranormal device. But that can't be right, considering this character updates the player on current events. But then again, don't think about it. What is the former? How do we know it's called the former? What is he former of? How does this thing relate to the astral plane and the board of directors? Why is this giant ass paranormal monster trapped in a refrigerator? Don't think about it. Why doesn't Jesse act like a normal human being even though she's gunning down normal human beings who are simply possessed? Has she killed before? When I first started playing this game, I thought the plot twist was going to be Jesse Faden was a serial killer, but that can't be the case. But don't think about it. Why are all the NPC characters morally, ethically, and conventionally good and spout only exposition when they work for a clandestine government agency that apparently abducts children and sacrifices gaggle of employees fighting these supernatural depths of the unknown? It could be because you play as the director of the entire agency of this terrible organization filled with horrible people, or my favorite answer, don't think about it. Narratively, this game is about not making sense, and overall, narratively, it's a mess that doesn't answer the questions that matter. And this, or worse considering, protagonist is a representation of the forces she can't control nor attempt to understand. But like I said, this can be all explained away by saying that's the point. You cannot rationalize or understand the unknown because it is unknown. But I bring up again, Final Crisis by DC Comics and Remedy Entertainment's sleeper hit cult classic, Alan Wake.
The loose sheets of paper were pages from a manuscript entitled Departure. I was named the author. The book I couldn't remember was either a terrible and true prophecy or an act of creation that had rewritten the world. I began to hunt the pages feverishly, for they held the answer to the mystery. With it, I could save myself. I could save Alice.
There's too many of them!
It's your fault and you're gonna pay for it.
Look out!
You must finish what you started.
Stay right where you are,
All right. I'll fix it. I'll bring her back.
Alan Wake is about our protagonist, Alan Wake, a man trapped within his own fictional creations from his novellas that are trying to kill him, appearing as beings of darkness that the player are able to kill and defeat or enlighten. But here's the plot twist. You, the player, are playing through a story that was already written by the main character, making the events somewhat preordained, but he doesn't remember writing it because he has writer's block, meaning that he couldn't have wrote it, but he did. These lost manuscripts throughout the game perfectly explain what the player's feeling and what the main character Alan is experiencing in-game, which is very metaphorical and not unironic because, like I said earlier, video game narratives, when executed properly, have meaning in everything. There isn't anything in this game that is there just to be there, because this game is more than its scenario. But skipping over the heavily analytical aspects of the game, the hiss within Control is very much like the darkness in Alan Wake, but the hiss literally has no meaning to it, and it doesn't add any depth to the narrative. The hiss only explains to be an evil force that the game said it is because it needed something to be evil so the story could have an antagonist and do a story. The darkness in Alan Wake is an evil force that the main protagonist fights against, but it also has a metaphorical double meaning. Much like in Control, the darkness in Alan Wake can infect people, causing them to behave insane, talking insanely. But unlike Control versus Alan Wake, the hiss just makes people say insane things, while the darkness in Alan Wake imitates human beings, creating the ideal or distorted image of who that person is, boiling what they are into a stereotype mimicking people's dark desires and impulses. Like how the Dark Presence aka Mr. Scratch uses Allison's guilt to drive the direction of the story by telling him he can rewrite them back into reality, them being Alice, his wife. But what Alan doesn't know is the darkness would escape as consequence for him writing them back into reality. But here's the problem with the darkness. It shrouds and distorts people's perception of reality, hiding it. And the only thing that can pierce through this black shroud is light. And Alan Wake's light is both a metaphor and a weapon to help the player navigate the darkness and guide as they fight the forces of evil. It reveals things about who someone is and the unknown world around Alan to gain knowledge to defeat the darkness because knowledge is power. And specifically in the case of gameplay mechanics, Alan reveals the darkness showing his true nature, but then, and only then, when he does, he's able to vanquish it. Listen to this, for example.
You get 2 pills in the morning, and then you'll be nice and calm all day long.
Which corresponds with what a nurse does. The darkness takes the truth of someone and reduces it down to what the person is, but forgets to add the complexities and flaws of an individual, basically limiting someone to nothing but their title. Here's another example from the live actions cutscenes.
So, what are you, a detective or a peeping Tom?
Both. A reporter.
Kinky.
Interesting choice of decor you have there.
That's Alan Wake, the writer. I'm a big fan.
I can see that.
What can I say? I like writers.
Yeah, that's mainly what the book's all about.
Welcome to the Oh Dear Diner.
Hi, I was wondering if you could help me. I'm looking for...
Mr. Wake, Alan Wake. Oh, God, I am your biggest fan. I know people say that all the time, but I really am.
I'm glad to hear that.
Rose.
Rose knew she had been gushing, but right now, she didn't care. As far as she was concerned, her brief meeting with Alan Wake was literally the high point of...
Here's her character when she gets infected by the darkness.
Welcome to... Oh dear, Mr. Wake. I'm so glad you're here.
Rose, you have my manuscript?
Oh. Oh yes. Yes. Please, come in.
Here's her character when the darkness has completely taken her over.
Welcome to the Oh Dear Diner. What can I get you today? Coffee?
Notice how the character gets taken over by a stereotype of what a waitress is, against what little complexity this character once had, making her human, but you must wonder, what does Alan Wake have to do with control? Well, the simple answer is this.
I used to know where fiction ends and reality begins. Here, they're all the same. It's a hideous trap, my every thought made real. Fear, desire. How can I ever know for sure I've escaped and not just lost in my own fantasy of it? That thought alone can drive you insane.
And then there's this phenomenal ending.
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
So, if the darkness is the hiss, or being trapped in the astral plane with the hiss, or something connected to the hiss, then what the fuck does any of this dialogue mean?
Push the fingers through the surface into the wet. You've always been the new you. You want this
Can you
to
stop
be
that?
true.
Please.
Not exactly the reunion I'd hoped for.
It feels good to say those words. I want to say them. They sound good. They make me feel good. Don't you want to say them too?
No.
What does this mean, you must wonder? The answer is still the same. Don't think about it. These are one of the hundreds of questions left unanswered this game leaves behind after 15 to 20 hours of playtime. When looking at Control as a whole, it seems as if this game was the leftover ideas of other games Remedy had and decided to slam it all into this one game called Control. Alan Wake leads its story with some questions, but the genre of Alan Wake is horror, reminiscent of Stephen King novels, so of course there will be some questions left behind, but the questions it leaves behind that this game answers in text documents because they take place in the same universe, aren't plot or narrative breaking, which makes this story suck dick. But at the end of the day, Alan Wake's a story about stories and the creative inspiration those stories have on others, because Alan Wake wouldn't have happened if Alan's story wasn't inspired by the previous author who came to the lake that wrote himself out of existence after killing his wife in an attempt to kill the darkness, which brings into question the legitimacy of free will in the story, considering it was already written by one author who wrote himself out of existence, but still present in the story, yet everyone remembers him, and another author that is slowly going insane and being driven by a paranormal dark energy where events are preordained. These are interesting questions, but back to Control, where the questions never end. Getting into the gameplay mechanics, the game only gives you one weapon, the service weapon, also known as the Director's Weapon, which is literally Thor's the God of Thunder's hammer, Mjolnir, or King Arthur's sword, Excalibur. The screenwriters weren't sure, and the game said it's either of the two, but that's what they believe most likely, so that's what I'm assuming. But realistically, there is only one option that is most effective against enemies in this game: shooting and launching objects at something. If your gun runs out of charge, launch a bunch of shit at it until you can't. And when that happens, you shoot the hell out of it until you can launch some more shit at it. As is explained in game, the service weapon is a shape-shifting firearm that can assume a variety of different forms with different applications depending on the person, as it has drastically changed throughout history, appearing akin to the general collective unconscious perception of a weapon, essentially meaning this gun could be a rock one day, or a flashlight. But in the case of this game, you have 5 different weapons variations, where only 2 of them are actually useful. In its grip formation, the service weapon becomes a standard sidearm form, and operates similar to a revolver, featuring a high accuracy rate and a single shot damage. If you select the proper modifications for this gun, it is the only weapon you'll need to complete this game, if you can aim properly, because it's the most accurate weapon in the game. It also does the most amount of damage and uses the least amount of charge, which makes it the most effective weapon in the game. There's also the Shatter, which is similar to a shotgun, dealing a long and wide blast radius but short range per shot damage, which sounds useful but really isn't most of the time, considering you'll be fighting enemies at long ranges. How much charge this weapon uses, in addition to damage being output being equivalent to the grip formation properly modded per shot, that's completely and virtually useless, considering in the late game you're going to be flying around and shooting enemies. There's also the Spin, which is a rapid fire weapon with low accuracy but a higher rate of fire, which is good for nothing because damage it unleashes isn't good. Also, you're going to be flying around fighting enemies mid and late game, which is completely useless via accuracy wise. The Pierce, which is a highly powerful single shot that can destroy the environment of the oldest house and the environment around you, allowing for it to damage enemies behind cover and with armor, which is extremely useful because this weapon functions as an RPG and does a lot of damage, and it hurts things behind cover, and it hurts things with shield, and it hurts things that can generate cover. And the final weapon of the game, the Charge, a weapon that fires charge shots that are completely useless and not accurate in any way, considering how long it takes to fire the weapon, in addition to the weapon just sucking a majority of the time, meaning all the time. And when it comes to weapon mods, this game isn't Warframe. It's very simple. Logic dictates what you should put on what weapon in what situation, or what you should permanently use as a weapon mod, because it simply makes sense. Increased health and increased damage simply because none of the other mods are helpful, because why would you want less recoil when there is no recoil to begin with? Why would you want increased accuracy when the game accuracy is already perfect? Why would I trade less health for less energy spent on dodging an attack, when dodging an attack doesn't cost much energy to begin with? Much like I said, the only mods you want are increased damage and health. Thus, with all that said, you're going to be using grip formation and the Pierce form the majority of the game if you're smart about how you play the game. But when you're not using your service weapon to kill enemies, you're most likely using the main protagonist's psychic abilities. Overall, Jesse Faden is presumably one of the most powerful Pillarmeritans in this game, being able to use powers that are far beyond what has been achieved in the prior testing at the FBC, which stands for Federal Bureau of Control, when it comes to individuals who wield object as powers, such as Launch, which is a power that comes from a floppy disk that is allowed for telekinesis, or telekinetic abilities, giving Jesse the power to levitate objects in her environment and then throw them as projectiles at enemies, being the most basic power and the most iconic at the board, being the most useful in game as the power initially evolves. Shield, for example, allows Jesse to telekinetically rip objects from the environment, including concrete chunks from the walls and floors, and use them as makeshift barriers to block enemies. If this ability is upgraded, Jesse can also launch these projectiles forward in kinetic attacks similar to Launch. Evade, even though that shouldn't be a telekinetic ability, though it is used for some reason in this game, allows Jesse to utilize her telekinetic abilities to influence her own movement, moving rapidly for a short period of time, like a speedster, making it so that she can dodge enemy attacks or move quickly through battle scenarios, while the X-ray light box allows Jesse to seize or take over the minds of her enemies when an enemy is weak enough, like in the game Shadow of Mordor. Ultimately, all this accumulates together to create a pretty basic power moveset the game needs to be successful. However, with this unique world and setting, it's pretty lackluster that the game is watered down to these mechanics instead of using some more supernatural weapons around the oldest house. Speaking of the narrative more directly, this game takes place in the oldest house, in the Bureau of Control, which is also referred to as the oldest house, a clandestine federal agency that people pay taxes to that nobody knows about, unless the house wants you to know it exists because semper occultus. But to spoil the entire game, nothing much happens, and I'm quite serious about this. Nothing much happens. You go here, you do there, you do that one thing to go over there to do that other thing to get that one thing to do that one thing, then turn something off. That's the entire game. But here's what happens in actuality. The clandestine agency of Federal Bureau of Control is responsible for investigating paranormal phenomena, which defy ordinary reality, which usually manifests in the form of altered world events, which are incursions upon perceived reality shaped by the human collective unconsciousness, because these altered world events affect archetypical objects and give them unique properties referred to as altered items by the Federal Bureau of Control. They are contained within their headquarters at the oldest house, an enormous skyscraper in New York City, which no one can see because reasons and friend science. But alternatively, altered world events create objects of power, which are produced by altered world events and the incursions, granting certain individuals referred to as proletarians paranormal abilities by physically connecting objects of power to them from the astral plane, which is an alternate dimension housing something known as the board, an extra-dimensional entity which communicates through a massive inverted black pyramid because it does, and don't question why. But the board contains the Bureau's leadership through a ritual connected to a service weapon. This ritual includes a human being holding the service weapon to their head in a suicide-like fashion, and if they die, they are not the director, but if they live, they are the director, thereby being worthy of the weapon, thereby being worthy of the board, thereby being someone worth giving a damn about, because the weapon didn't kill you. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, the oldest house itself is both interior and exterior, supposedly infinite, constantly shifting space connecting to various alternate dimensional rooms known as thresholds, leading to other worlds and paranormal dimensions, which leads to the plot of the game. Jesse Faden then arrives at the oldest house at the behest of the astral entity known as Polaris, even though it doesn't communicate to us the player and a fact that we can hear, but ultimately it's a being looking for a new vessel to store itself in, and the unknowing main character who's yet to understand this or know this, while Jesse is seeking for the whereabouts of her younger brother Dylan, who went missing 17 years ago. And even though this entire plot is pivotal to the game's narrative, we can't play it, but we can only read about it in text documents and listen to audio tapes about it, because that makes sense. Anywho, Jesse and Dylan were involved in an altered world event, which isn't even playable in the game, I might add, where their hometown of Wisconsin was hit by a slide projector that was really an object of power capable of opening portals to other dimensions. Opens a portal to a dimension releasing paranormal properties into the world that result in the disappearance of ordinary Wisconsin's adult population, which is the name of the town she grew up in. Yep, that's right, the main character grew up in a town called Ordinary Wisconsin. Anyway, long story short, the FBC apprehended Dylan and the slide projector while Jesse fled, burning all but one of the slides from the projector. Jesse arrives at the oldest house through the guidance of Polaris, a paranormal entity which rescued her, which is not even playable in game or seen, and we just gotta take the text documents and audio logs word for it. While throughout the game, Jesse encounters various allies in the FBC, including research specialist Emily Pope, security chief Archer, head of operations Helen Marshall, and auntie, a mysterious Finnish janitor, the FBC's former director Zachariah Trench, who killed himself, and funny informative videos guy Dr. Casper Darling, the Bureau's missing head of research, who we never find in the game, even though I wish I did find him, cause he's a funny character. So I'm gonna blaze through this as quickly as possible without skipping out on any important details. At the start of the game, Jesse arrives at the oldest house as specified by Polaris, who only talks to Jesse by the way, and enters finding the building seemingly devoid of people, but then Jesse discovers that the Bureau's previous director, Zachariah French, apparently killed himself when he was really possessed by the hiss and decided to kill himself before he did something stupid while being possessed, so he just killed himself to stop the stupidity from happening, but it happened anyway. Thus, taking the service weapon from this dead man's corpse, Jesse is transported into the astral plane where she completes the ritual and is selected as the new director by the board. Jesse emerges from Trench's office and finds that the oldest house has been invaded by a hostile force known as the Hiss, which has possessed most of the Bureau's agents and corrupted the building, shifting the building's telemetry and topography. Thus, with all this shit going down, Jesse uses an object of power known as the hotline to listen to the lingering presence of the previous director, who relates that his former management team knows the secrets of the Bureau, and Jesse hopes that she may be able to find and discover the whereabouts of her brother Dylan. Here's where the story gets really strange. In the oldest house, time is a relative concept, meaning that 10 minutes in the oldest house could be 10 seconds outside. But immediately when Jesse becomes director after leaving the astral plane, everyone knows who she is, but she knows nobody. This is something the game doesn't address, but at first thought you'd believe there would be a time travel plot in this game where Jesse communicates with her past and future self, but there isn't, so it's weird, especially when some characters pretend to not even know you, even though other characters know you. Anyway, after doing a bunch of favors, even though you run the joint, Jesse aids other surviving agents of the FBC who had been quick enough to wear something called a Hadron Resonance Amplifier, which are wearable devices created by Dr. Darling that protect the users from the effects of the hiss, but don't need to protect the main character because Polaris protects her. This will be important for later. Anyway, Pope tells Jesse that the Otis house is on complete lockdown, even though that can't be true considering this is an environment of infinite space, until the hiss can be eradicated, which is impossible because his building is infinite, like I said, and it's literally just impossible to get rid of all the hiss. But even though that's the reality of the situation, Jesse enters the Otis house maintenance sector and is guided by Ati to repair the building's electricity and plumbing to prevent a major meltdown. Jesse then uses directorial override to reopen the sectors and enter the research sectors, producing more HRAs to save more lives because lives matter. But then Marshall reveals that Dylan is known as Prime Candidate Number 6, who is a candidate for the role of director due to his special abilities, but it was revealed also as well that he's completely unstable and psychotic, and he's psychotic. Thus, people using common sense threw him away in prison in the containment sector. And yes, you guessed it, Jesse makes a beeline to find her beloved brother Dylan, only to learn that he appeared suddenly in the executive sector and surrendered to the FBC agents for reasons unknown, where Dylan then tells Jesse that he has embraced the hiss because he's insane and psychotic, and believes it will set him free of the Bureau because their invasion was only made possible by the slide projector the Bureau recovered from ordinary Wisconsin, which isn't so ordinary. So later, Dylan warns Jesse not to trust Polaris, but Jesse for some reason finds the resolve to find and deactivate the slide projector, thinking would save Dylan, disconnecting him from the hiss and restore her brother to his normal self. But when Jesse investigates the Prime Candidate program, she learns that both she and Dylan were considered to be the role of director, and that the slide projector is contained in the research sector. But the problem is the slide projector is being protected by an elaborate maze, so Ati gives Jesse a cassette player which enables her to navigate the maze, which is protecting the slide projector. But in the chamber, Jesse finds the projector missing. And let me tell you something, that's some bullshit right there. It's like nobody knows where anything is in this goddamn building. So then we learn that Dr. Darling led several expeditions into the dimension to access to the slide projector, where he discovered the polyhedron-shaped organism that contained hedron, which is the source of the HRA reticence. And I already explained why this doesn't make sense. But as the story wraps up in this final act, Jesse discovers that hedron is Polaris, who called out Jesse to save her/it from the hiss. However, when Jesse reaches hedron's containment chamber, the hiss attacks and seemingly kills it. Even though you killed all the enemies, Polaris dies, and then Jesse's mind is invaded by the hiss as the hedron reticence falters, and it's pretty much game over. However, Ex Machina time, she is able to recover Polaris' essence within her and restore control because Ex Machina plot device that goes unexplained. And this is when we learn that Trench fell under the hiss's influence during one of Darling's expeditions. He stole and concealed a second slide and used it to let the hiss into the Otis house because he was possessed, and that was a smart idea for some reason. So at the end of the game, when Jesse finds a slide projector in the executive sector where everything that goes missing ultimately gets found for some reason, Jesse goes through it, enters the astral plane to confront Dylan, who's attempting to take over the board through the hiss, and I remind you, we don't know what the hiss or the board is. Anyway, Jesse defeats the hiss and cleanses Dylan, who falls into a coma conveniently, finally accepting her role as director, which doesn't make any sense narratively or character-wise, as her journey continues into the unknown to destroy the remaining hiss in order to restore order to the Bureau, which can't be done. The end. Overall, much like I said earlier, nothing really happens in this game, narratively. You go to a place to find what you're looking for, not to be there, to learn that you have to go somewhere else to get the thing, to get another thing, to go do another favor, to go get the thing, just for it to end up in the executive lounge. The characters are bland and disappointing, while the motivations of each character are subhuman or non-existent. Jesse as a character has this all-encompassing obsession to find her brother, but we, the player, know and learn nothing about her brother throughout the duration of the game. And when Jesse Faden isn't musing in narration about her self-obsessed motivation to somehow justify her low level of self-worth, all the other characters that aren't Darling or the Russian janitor are exposition waterfalls. You believe the writers would discuss Jesse's mental illness, that being codependency disorder, but it doesn't. But discussing enemies, which you've probably seen enough of considering the gameplay on screen, let's talk about the boss battles this game has. They all suck if they aren't on the main beaten path of the game. Everything interesting about this game is found within the side content, meaning you have to play the side quests to find the most interesting parts of the game. By discussing them individually, the first one is this. Tomasi was previously the head of communications at the Federal Bureau of Control and part of Zachariah Trench's management team, until he was taken by the Hiss during the invasion of the Odo's house. As a boss encounter, it's extremely lackluster. The level design allows for a level of versatility, allowing the player to hide behind a significant amount of natural cover, thus allowing the player to avoid every attack Tomasi throws at the player, while even the spawning enemies that generate are nothing but cannon fodder if for some reason you decide to play recklessly and stupidly run into the enemy's field of view with a complete disregard for survival. This boss encounter is nothing but a matter of you running behind cover and shooting, while using your launch ability to dispatch the weaker enemies. Overall, this boss encounter sucks. It isn't unique. Up next is Lynn Salvador. Due to the crammed area this boss takes place in, options for player movement around the battlefield become stalemated as you have to maneuver around tight spaces to try to survive. Not only are difficult enemies spawned into the room, but in addition to that, you're facing a boss who's hurling rocks and materials at you while you're being shot by all angles. The worst part of it is this boss has an endlessly regenerating shield, allowing him to block bullets. Therefore, using the pierce gun formation from the service weapon is almost mandatory in this battle because of its ability to break through shields, being the most powerful single shot weapon in the game besides the service pistol grip formation once you've modded the hell out of it. For me, in all honesty, this was a difficult boss battle. It requires a combination of shuffling back and forth between natural cover and dodging debris to survive, but more effectively using the Shadow of Mordor possession power is actually useful during this boss fight. But at the end of the day, the combo of throwing debris and hiding is your best bet to beat this bastard. Following him comes my second favorite boss in this game because he seems so interesting. It's called the Former. It's an extra-dimensional being existing within the astral plane, speaking in similar language to the board, which is the giant black upside-down pyramid you speak to in-game, that you get orders from, if you remember. But the lore behind this thing is that the Former somehow seized control of various altered items and attempted to utilize them to gain a foothold in the Otis house for some unknown reason. How does it connect to the board? Don't think about it. But the lore isn't complex. I just find the lore behind why this thing could possibly exist in a refrigerator interesting. The only thing required from the player to defeat this monstrosity is to be mobile, watching the tendril as they try to crush you. This is the part of the game where invading becomes actually useful in flying, making things beyond simplified and easier. But by the time the sun sets, you use levitation, throw objects at the boss, and use weapons with high rates of fire to do damage. But do not stay in one place and from time to time look at the ground to know where the holes are after the tendrils hit so you don't fall in one. But if you really want to do damage, if you upgraded your skill points far enough, you can redirect the eyeballs it throws at you back at it, which takes a large chunk of health out of the monster. Overall, boss is fun every time. 2 more to go. The Mold is a pretty damn interesting boss and difficult because it has a variety of attacks. It has death tentacles, it throws or vomits projectiles at you, and the worst of it all, it uses poison gas while simultaneously knocking exploding plants on your head. So if you gotta dodge and change locations rapidly by using levitation while quickly dodging to avoid the toxins and exploding plants. But you have to use telekinesis to chuck debris at the boss to destroy the flower of the boss, because that's its weak spot. So when those tendrils get impaled into the ground, fire those bullets into that plant till you see the blood sploosh out till it's dead. This is another side quest boss battle where the piercer formation is useful, but overall this is one of the more difficult bosses in game that isn't a part of the main story, and it's freaking awesome. But coming to the final boss, oh shit, hang on. So this bitch is called the Anchor. It's beyond simple. It's a giant ball of death that fires books at you, but killing this thing is extremely simple, considering that it can only attack in one direction while it's on a timer. Thus, the only thing required of the player is so little. A gorilla can do it. You fly to the next ledge when it shoots shit at you, dodge the books it spits at you, then chuck a clock at the bastard when this mouth opens up. Do that 6 or 7 times depending on how much extra damage you can do through your upgrades and mods through throwing items, and it'll eventually die. But moving along to the final boss that I really like, there is SJ, an alternate reality version of the main protagonist in game trapped in a mirror dimension and or reality. But what's really cool about the boss is that it has the exact same powers as you do, and it's actually an effective killer, which means you need to hide by natural cover, run around like a little bitch, and use everything you learned throughout your playthrough to pull out a win. In the beginning, reverse Jesse shoots missiles at you, and the crazy thing is, the reload's faster than the missiles that the player can actually shoot. However, the boss isn't as fast as you are, mobility wise anyway, therefore you should be able to deplete her health by catching the rockets and throwing them at her like returning mail. In the second phase of the boss, Reverse Jesse uses all forms of telekinesis you don't want used against you. Cover, shields, levitation, throwable tables, and rockets. The best way to deal with this situation is to simply run around like a little cheerleader and deal as much damage as you possibly can before you get pelted with rocks. But when you enter the final stage, you'll need to use everything that you can in natural environment for cover while using shields to take out Reverse Jesse. There isn't much to say about what to do, but play smart and don't act like a dumbass. But at the end of my critiquing review of Control, overall, Control wasn't worth the full price for me personally with its lackluster story and dick-sucking characters. But I believe it's a game that should be played if you're interested in game design. It's not a bad game by far, however, it's in my belief games like this should exist more. Games that aren't cranked out every year by mandate, by something brought into creation by people who want it to exist because they are passionate about what they desire to create. A studio's love and passion all shoved into one game. Control as a game is a passion project, and I can appreciate the hard work and extreme level of detail that went into the design of this visual masterpiece, but it's not without its flaws. And I'm excited for the 3 DLC stories that'll be expanding both the lore and the world and hopefully provide answers to the overall narrative, continuing the story. So if I have to give this a number score, I'm gonna give it a 7.5 out of 10. This game is the result of someone mixing peanut butter and chocolate, then calling it a game.